So, lecture on Aristotle. As far as his bio goes, Aristotle is wealthy as well, just like Plato. However, Aristotle is not from Athens. He's from another Greek city called Thebes. He did go to Athens to attend Plato's academy. He does become Plato's star pupil, and in fact, he's so good that he gets a job at the academy teaching classes of his own. Many people expect Aristotle to take over from Plato once he retires. Unfortunately for him, Plato picks his own nephew instead of Aristotle. Aristotle gets upset and he leaves back to Thebes, leaving behind Athens and the academy. But, not to be outdone by Plato, he uses his wealth to create his own school called the Lyceum. One of the most famous students that Aristotle had at the Lyceum is Alexander of Macedonia, many known to many of you as Alexander the Great. Um, One of the reasons Alexander the Great conquered many countries around the Mediterranean and parts of Central Asia was in an effort to civilize everyone by making them rational in the way that he had been um, taught by Aristotle. Um, the other thing he was trying to do is he was trying to conquer his way eastward across Asia to prove whether Aristotle was correct about another sea or another ocean out there far east. I'm assuming that Aristotle was either talking about the Indian Ocean or the Pacific Ocean, but since Alexander the Great never made it that far, dying at the tender age of 33 from poison somewhere mid India, um, we'll never find out which ocean Aristotle was referring to. In an effort to civilize and make everyone rational, um, Alexander the Great built great libraries in every major city that he conquered, right? And he would leave behind translators who would then work at, not only um, making copies of Greek texts, but also making copies of whatever texts were available from that area that had been conquered, and creating like a real, genuine exchange of knowledge. And presumably, this part of Alexander is something that was gained from Aristotle, his teacher. Coming back to Aristotle, um, so each of the books that we have of Aristotle's has a very kind of like generic name, right? Like there's his book on physics is just called physics. His book on metaphysics is just called metaphysics. His book on logic is just called, well, he's got actually a number of those. And some of them are like anterior analytics, posterior analytics, but they're still kind of very generic names. The reason for that is because those books by Aristotle are actually the notes from his students, um, based off of the lectures Aristotle was giving in that particular class. So those are the lecture notes that we have of Aristotle. Um, Another thing to kind of keep in mind is that a lot of these names for subjects, like physics or metaphysics, um, are names created by Aristotle for his classes. And that's where, and now we name entire field of study based off the name that Aristotle gave for these. Aristotle was not happy with Plato's dialogues. Um, like, for example, the Republic, which we talked about in the last class. And I think many of you might sympathize with what Aristotle's about to say. See, Aristotle thought, you know, when you look at the Republic, it's got everything all rolled up into one, right? It's got political theory in there. It's got ethical theory in there. It's got poetry in there and literature. It's got religious ideas as well. Um, it's got historical analysis. So Aristotle thought that Plato's Republic was just a hot mess. It had everything kind of swirled in there, and it's hard to kind of read it and tease out what's political and what's ethical and so on. So Aristotle, being a good little analytical that he was, um, he made his lecture notes and his books and his classes I into like just one subject, right? So when he did physics, he was only talking about physical objects moving through space and time, and that's it. Um, he's got some interesting theories in there, but I'm not going to cover them in this lecture, like in terms of his physics and metaphysics. Primarily because almost everything he said has been disproven, right? Um, if some of you are like history buffs and you like to kind of study the history of some ideas, even if they were wrong ideas, then that you might want to take a class on Aristotle, at a later date. Since it's an intro class, I don't have time to dig into him that much as we'd like to. So, rather than spending time talking about ideas he had that were wrong, I'd rather talk about some of his more valuable ideas. And so, instead of looking at physics or metaphysics in Aristotle, I'm just going to kind of focus on his book called the Nicomachean Ethics, which is obviously an ethical book. So, in the Nicomachean Ethics, literally the first sentence of the first chapter of the first book states, all actions aim at some good. And what he wants us to recognize is that everything people do is in the pursuit of something they consider to be good. People brush their teeth because they think it's good to want to keep your teeth into old age. People go to work because they think it's good to get paid so that you can have a roof over your head and food in your stomach, right? Um, what Aristotle goes on right afterwards to point out, however, is that even though every single person makes every single choice in the pursuit of what they consider to be good, the world around us is a mess because we can't seem to agree on what good means. And this creates not only debates and different schools of thought, but more importantly, it creates political conflicts. It creates personal conflicts. It creates crime and murder and war and genocide even. And so Aristotle says, well, rather than engaging each other like this, why don't we try to figure out how to define the good? How to come up with a test for what makes something good. And that way we can handle this rationally instead of like primates. So Aristotle comes up with a test to determine, the good of a thing in particular. And what he determines is that when we talk about something being good, right, like a good horse or a good hammer, right, what makes it good is two things. One, the good is usually connected to something unique to that thing, right? Something that is unique to that thing as what it is. And second, that good is usually intrinsic, which means it's built into the thing itself, and it's not something that you can remove from it. All right. Example. Um, what makes a good horse is that it's strong, so that it can run fast and pull heavy weight. That's what makes a good horse. Notice the strength of a horse is different from, for example, the strength of a dog. Right? Yes, you can have a strong dog, like if you have a full pit bull or something, they're solid muscle, incredibly strong. But no matter how strong that dog is, right, there's a strength that's unique to horses, so that the horse's strength can pull a wagon in a way that a pit bull cannot pull a wagon. Right? It's a unique form of strength. Second, the strength is built into the muscle of the horse. The only way to get rid of it is to kill the horse. Right? I mean, you break its legs, it's not strong anymore, and generally horses die when they get broken legs. Not only because the farmers shoot them, but I mean, it won't be able to walk, it won't be able to reset its bones, and it won't be able to drink or eat. So one way or the other, the you know, the strength of the horse is not only unique to the horse; it's literally built into the horse itself. and you can't just take it away without literally destroying the horse, right? So that's just like an example of what he means by unique and intrinsic. So he moves on and he says, okay, so let's apply this to human beings. And there's a lot of debate about what kind of a life is a good life, right? Remember, they're Greeks, and the Greeks are always talking about eudaimonia, the good life. So one of the things that Aristotle points out is, well, let's start there. What do we mean by good life, right? Obviously, we mean a good life for human beings, but there's no agreement. Some people pursue the life of pleasure, right? Fulfilling your desires, feeling good as the good life. Other people think the life of honor is a good life, the life of popularity, the life of power, the life of politics, the life of fame. That's what they think is the good life because they want to reach immortality or whatever. And then other people think that the life of contemplation, the life of thought, the life of learning is the good life for human beings. And so Aristotle decides, hey, well, let's go ahead and test this out, right? Um, let's test each of them to see if they're unique and intrinsic. And so he starts off with the life of pleasure. And Aristotle points out pursuing pleasure and avoiding pain is not unique to human beings. Every single animal you can think of pursues pleasure and avoids pain. Um, so, in many ways, if you're living from weekend to weekend, party to party, drug high to drug high, or drunken intoxication to drunken intoxication, or sexual bliss to sexual bliss. Like if this is what motivates you in your life, Aristotle's arguing you're not living a human life, you're living the life of an animal. And he's not just trying to be insulting. This means something very important politically for Greeks. You have to remember that for Greeks, full rights of citizenship were meant only for what they considered somebody who was fully human. This is why the Greeks, like in Athens, for example, Athens created democracy and the idea of freedom and rights, but they also owned slaves. So how did they reconcile this contradiction? Well, for the Greeks, they thought that freedom and democracy and rights were things that were reserved only for fully humans who were not enslaved to animal desire. And slaves were, according to their way of thinking, subhuman, right? They look human, they talk human, they walk human, but in the end they were animal on the inside because they were enslaved to their pleasures and passions, to their desires and appetites. That's why you keep seeing pleasure and appetite and desire popping up a lot, right? We saw it with Plato, now we're seeing it with Aristotle. And so for Aristotle, the life of pleasure is not unique to human beings, and it fails the first part of the test. Worse, um, it's not intrinsic. Even though the pleasure is something you feel on the inside, the source of the pleasure is often something on the outside, right? Something that can be taken from you. Um, some of you get pleasure from alcohol. Somebody can take your alcohol away, or you finish it yourself. Then what? Some of you get pleasure from movies. Movies can be erased. Streaming services can delete them. Um, a hacker can wipe them out at some point. Or maybe you no longer pay your bills and you no longer have access to them. And so the point here is that like the sources of pleasure are external to us, and therefore they can be taken from us. And Aristotle doesn't want to base happiness and a good life on something that can be taken from you by someone else. So notice the life of pleasure fails both parts of the test. That's why you see it here with two X's. Moving on to the life of honor. Life of fame, right? Life of immortality, life of power. Aristotle points out this is unique to humans, right? You don't see chimpanzees or lions or squids, uh, you know, trying to become immortal, you know, wanting to do concerts in arenas to hear thousands of people chanting their name. They don't want to see themselves in history books. They don't want statues of themselves in the parks. So this pursuit of fame and immortality is something unique to human beings. We haven't seen it in any of the animals other than humans. So it passes the first part of the test, right? However, it's not intrinsic because fame and power depend on other people. All it takes is one wrong comment to get canceled. All it takes is one bad album for no one to buy your concert tickets anymore. All it takes is one bad decision to lose your voter base if you're a powerful politician. So whether it's power or fame, whether it's T-shirts or streets named after you, or whatever the case may be, right? The life of honor depends on other people, and those other people and their feelings for you can change from one second to the next. So it passes the uniqueness, it fails the intrinsic. That's why you see one check and one exit. Moving on. Life of contemplation, life of wisdom, life of gaining knowledge. Unique to human beings, definitely. Other animals are curious, other animals can learn, but the idea that they like investigate, study the universe just for the sake of studying the universe, you know, that they want knowledge for the sake of knowledge, that they want to pass that knowledge on to others of their species through books, through lectures, through recordings on a computer, right? That's not something that other animals do, right? The pursuit of wisdom and knowledge for its own sake is something unique to human beings, and it passes the first part of the test. Is knowledge and contemplation, is wisdom intrinsic? It is. Once you gain knowledge, no one can take it from you without killing you, kind of like the horse, right? So, knowledge is, once you gain that knowledge, it's inside your mind. It's there for the rest of your life. It's not something that can be taken from you. And even if somebody burnt all the libraries down, you can continue learning from your own experiences. You can continue learning from life itself, from seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, right? So notice there's no way for them to like take the life of contemplation from you. There's no way to remove the wisdom once you have it. And even if they take away the sources of knowledge like libraries and books or the internet, the fact is the human being can still learn even without those things. There's no real way to stop it. And so the life of contemplation ends up, for Aristotle, passing the test. If you want the good life, that good life requires the life of contemplation. Eudaimonia requires the gaining of wisdom. And so Aristotle concludes from this, right, the life of contemplation is the good life, that we need wisdom or intellectual excellence to reach eudaimonia. But, right, there's always a but. Aristotle recognizes that very often people know what's good or what's right and then still be too weak to follow through on it, right? The point is that Aristotle's making is that sometimes knowledge and wisdom are necessary for reaching the good life and making good decisions, but sometimes they're not enough. There's something else missing from the equation. And so he winds up coming up with a new equation. He says, eudaimonia, or the good life, requires intellectual excellence, wisdom, plus moral excellence, virtue, whatever that is. Both are necessary. But what exactly is moral excellence? We know intellectual excellence is wisdom, it's knowledge. You study, you learn, right? You can't reach a good life if you don't know how to balance your budget. You cannot reach a good life if you don't know how to raise your kids, to become good individuals who are not causing problems on themselves and you and the world around them, right? There's no way to reach a good life without that kind of knowledge. So we understand the intellectual excellence, But what exactly is the moral excellence? And for that, he goes back to studying people, right? And he realizes, okay, when we look at people who have good self-control, people who have the ability to follow through on what they know is right, how did they get it, right? And he points out that some of them have it, some of them have it gifted from the gods. Some of them have it gifted from parental genetics. Some of them have it raised in them by good parents, right? And none of these help us because either you got those things or you don't. But he says if we look carefully, what we notice from all of those is there's some inward pull, right? There's something inside of you that pulls you towards following through on what you know is good, or that pulls you on pulls you towards something that you know is bad. There's an inner pulling, right? And he says this pull feels like a habit. And when it comes to vice, it's usually a habit of too much of something, or a vice of too little of something. And when the pull is a pull towards virtue or excellence, that's because it pulls you towards a balance between too much and too little. And so this is where he gets the theory of the golden mean, right? Remember, a mean, right? It's kind of something in that middle point. Aristotle points out that when it comes to virtue, right? Virtue comes from balance between too much or too little, right? And in the chart here, we see that if you have too much, if you don't have enough courage, you're a coward, right? If you have too much courage, you're rash or reckless. Only by having just the right amount of courage can you be brave, right? Brave people don't go around risking their lives unnecessarily. But they don't run from a fight either, right? So if you look through all of these, there's this kind of balancing between too much or too little of something. And that's where we get virtue from. Okay? Now, remember, these are habits. Either you have a bad habit of too much of something, too much fear, or you have a bad habit of too little of something, too little fear, or you have a good habit of having just the right amount of fear, right? To kind of go with the example we've been talking about. So, Aristotle points out, right, that virtue and vice exist on a spectrum, right? There's a spectrum that exists with too much or too little on either end, and virtue right in the middle, right in that middle point. And Aristotle points out our job, right, is not only to gain wisdom, intellectual excellence, but also to conquer bad habits and replace them with good habits. This is where Aristotle tells us that humans must work to make second nature into first nature. In other words, you create new habits by building repetition to replace old habits, right? So how does that work, right? Like if we know that vice is too much or too little of something, how do we compensate? And so as you see here with the arrows, I know it's a bit of a mess with the red and green arrows, but bear with me for a second, all right? Let's say that you suffer from too little courage, right? You're a coward. You're somewhere over here on the left side. What Aristotle points out is you should not be trying to change your habit by trying to aim for virtue, okay? Don't aim for the middle ground, because there's a natural pull that's going to pull you away back towards fear, right? So you don't aim for the middle, because if you aim for the middle, your habits are going to pull you back, and you're going to wind up still on the coward side right here. That's the wrong one. That's why it's in red. Instead, Aristotle says we should aim at the opposite extreme. And our natural pull will pull us back from that other extreme so that we land in that happy middle ground of virtue. If you're a coward, you should aim for being reckless and being rash, right? If you are scared of fights to the point where you never defend yourself or your loved ones, Aristotle says you should aim to getting into fights all the time. Why? Because the best way to face your fear is to face your fear, right? If you're scared of a fight, maybe the only way to remove it is to be getting into as many fights as possible, right? Um, by being once you're in several fights, you begin to realize it's not the end of the world. Um, this is why, like some parents, when their kids are getting bullied, they take their kids to like a boxing gym, so that they can not only be trained in how to fight, but so they can be put into the ring, right, with some pads on, to get into a few fights, so that they can kind of get their feet wet and realize it's not really the end of the world. A lot of victims of bullying, it's not just that they don't know how to fight; it's that they get paralyzed, you know, with fear, and they don't react. Right, their fight or flight instinct gets frozen on them, and so the best way to do fix that, they follow Aristotle's advice. Hey, I'm going to take my kid. I'm going to throw him in the middle of a boxing ring, which is kind of a controlled environment, and let them kind of get beaten up a little bit, but in a safe way, to where they lose the fear of getting beaten up, so that they can kind of start reacting. So one of the things I want you to notice about Aristotle's theory of the golden mean is that this idea of aiming for the opposite extreme so that you reach in a happy middle ground is something that we've actually been adopting for many years, because we have been influenced by Aristotle. When you go to rehab because you have a drug habit, what are you doing? You're going from doing too many drugs, and you're aiming at getting away from drugs completely. The hope is that hopefully that way you learn to create a new habit where you can stay away from it. Now, what exactly is the golden mean? That Aristotle points out varies from individual to individual, right? As you can see here in the picture, everybody's different. They're different heights, different weights, different um, ethnic backgrounds, different genders, etc. Um, and if you guys knew me in class instead of an online course, you would see I'm 6'5". I'm about 270 pounds. I'm about 50 years old, and you know, I could probably drink more alcohol, for example, than say a 21-year-old who's like 5'5" and weighs 125 pounds, right? Because I'm bigger, my body can absorb more alcohol. So I'm using alcohol as an example of the ways in which like people are different. So the right amount of alcohol for me is different from the right amount of alcohol for you. And the same thing is true about fear. The same thing is true about money. The same thing is true about power. The same thing is true about sex, right? There's the right amount, the golden mean is different for different people because of their physical realities, right? So when he's telling you to look for the golden mean, right, it's not something you can get as advice from somebody else. It's something you have to figure out for yourself with your own realities. So notice that um, ethics for Aristotle, right, the way you reach a good life is by cultivating the self cultivation, improvement. The idea is you don't just settle for whatever habits you have, you work your butt off trying to fix those habits. Make bad habits into good habits. Make second nature into first nature. Right? And that requires wisdom. That requires learning and contemplation. Again, notice Aristotle's kind of agreeing with Socrates. Um, you have to know yourself. You have to know your strengths and your weaknesses, and then you have to know how to go about fixing those weaknesses. That's how you reach a good life. That's how you achieve excellence. for Aristotle. Now, the book doesn't end there. He goes on to the topic of friendship, right? And he talks about how there's three types of friendship. There's friends that basically share pleasure, right? And here he's not talking about like friends with benefits, right? I know some of you that's where your mind goes. What he means is that like there's certain people you hang out with because you guys like the same stuff. You guys are in college, so the best example for a lot of you is like your party friends, right? There's friends that you party with. You like the same type of music, you like the same type of alcohol, you like to go to the same types of bars, and so those are friends of pleasure. And Aristotle rejects them as a real friendship. Why? Because what happens when you no longer share the same pleasure? Now I know it's hard for you to understand. You guys are not going to believe me when I tell you this, but there's going to be a certain point where you're not really going to be interested in going to bars anymore, where you're not going to be interested in going to nightclubs, where you're not going to be interested in drinking, every single weekend anymore. It's called age and maturity. And when you get to that point, what do you have left with these friends that's all you ever did with, right? What you're going to notice is those friends are going to disappear because in the end they weren't a real friendship like Aristotle says. They just happen to be somebody that you share pleasures with, but once the pleasures are gone, their company and association is gone. Second type of friendship, utility, usefulness, right? In other words, there's certain type of people you call friends because you use them. Um, Maybe they're taking notes in classes for you because they take such great notes and they attend all the time, and you would rather sleep in. Maybe there's friends that you use to help you with writing essays because they're good at it. Maybe there's friends that have money that are willing to pay for you on a regular basis. Maybe there's friends that are bigger than you that make you feel protected and safe, and so you go out with them. Those are people you're using. Bottom line. And what Aristotle points out is again, that's not a real friendship because once they're no longer useful, they're gone. And so the only real kind of um, friendship that exists is the third kind, what he calls, what some people on the internet or other scholars call reciprocal goodwill. A friendship where you care about each other because you care about each other. As you see here in the bullets, right, it's friends for the sake of friends. You're friends with them because you actually care what happens to them, and you want to be around and you want to help them out, right? Not because they want, and they don't keep you around because they want that help. They keep you around because they want to help you out because they care about you, right? These are where there's like you bring out the good in each other, you bring out the best in each other. You both, kind of are good for each other, right? And there's, certain types of experiences and familiarity that are required that have to be shared. Like you had to have gone through certain things with each other when you were growing up that kind of creates that bond, kind of like the bond you have with family, right? But without the blood. Um, and so, you know, the point that he's kind of making here is that those those are the only real friends you have, right? Those are the ones that are doesn't matter if you haven't talked in 2 or 10 years. As soon as you do talk, it's like you never stop talking, right? You pick up right where you left off because there's a bond there, and that bond is real. Now, some of you may be wondering why is he talking about friendship in the middle of a book on ethics? Remember, for Aristotle, ethics, ethos, right, is about establishing um, what's necessary for a good life. And one of the things Aristotle's trying to point out is that there's no such thing as a good life without good friends. And that you have to be able to recognize what makes a good friend and surround yourself with those people only in order for you to be able to build that good life. Now, the other thing that he points out is that's important for a good life is politics. What he points out is it does no good for you to build a great life for yourself while the political state is burning all around you. Kind of like that meme, right, where the guy's drinking his coffee, saying this is fine while it's burning around him. No matter how good the life is that you build for yourself, right? Maybe a good business, nice house, strong family, lots of love, surrounded by good friends. You work hard to build that life for yourself. But if the political system around you is crumbling through corruption or chaos or civil war or foreign invasion, etc., right? There's no way you're going to be able to maintain that good life for yourself. Notice the quote from Aristotle: man is by nature a social animal. An individual who is unsocial naturally and not accidentally is either beneath our notice or more than human. Society is something that precedes the individual. Anyone who either cannot lead the common life or is so self sufficient as to not need to, and therefore does not partake of society, is either a beast or a god. And what Aristotle's kind of saying here is that a human who could totally live by themselves away from human society would either be an animal, a beast, right, living out in the woods or the wild or the jungle, or they would be a god, right, living up in the heavens, like Mount Olympus. Um, the average human needs other humans, and not just because we need them to help us build houses and roads and invent machines like cars, because we can't do it all ourselves. Yes, that's true, but also we need each other even on an emotional level, on an intellectual level, right? Um, it, you know, the famous African saying, "It takes a village to raise a child." So, you know, the same is true here for Aristotle, right? So, notice that in even though it's a book on ethics, which is for the Greeks a book on building a good life, for Aristotle that good life requires not only you be surrounded by good people that are good friends, but also that you take a role in politics. For Aristotle, ethics and politics are two sides of the same coin, right? You have to build a good life for yourself individually, but you also have to build a good state to live in collectively. And without both sides involved, there's no way you can have a good life or a good state. One last point about Aristotle's ideas on the good life. He says, if we do not call the dead man happy, and if Solon does not mean this, but that one can then safely call a man blessed as being at last beyond evils and misfortunes, this also affords matter for discussion. For both evil and good are thought to exist for a dead man, as much as for one who is alive, but not aware of them. In other words, honors and dishonors, the good and bad fortunes of children, and in general of descendants. What does he mean? Because he's saying a lot, right? What he's saying is that no matter how hard you work at building a good life, right, in the end, destiny always plays a role too. There are people who have done everything right and their life still turned into a disaster. There are people who built great lives, raised their children right, did nothing wrong, and then their children just burn it all down to the ground. Or history remembers them as evil, right? I mean, because of the stories people tell about them. So, one of the points that Aristotle's trying to make is, um, you got to keep in mind that it's a lot of work on yourself, and it's a lot of work on the society around you in order to build a good life. But at the same time, you always have to keep a flexibility within you that recognizes that shit happens, right? And sometimes that stuff is out of your control, and you have to learn to roll with the punches rather than to be rigid. You have to learn to recognize, you know, that you're not a god and you're not in control of all things. And when things go bad, you adapt, you learn, you evolve, and you move forward. Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Um, we move away from the Greeks with the next lecture. Um, moving, we're still in the Mediterranean, but we're moving to the Middle East, where we can look at the Old Testament of the Jewish Hebrew tribes, and then look at the beginning of Christianity with the New Testament as well. I'll see you in the next lecture.